Witam
Good
serdecznie.
evening, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to welcome you yet again to a meeting organized by Krytyka Polityczna and the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation in Warsaw. This meeting has a very current title, Post-Election America, Is Trumpism a Thing of the Past? Before I introduce our guests, I would like to ask Ernst Hillebrand, the head of the Warsaw Fest office, to welcome our guests.
Yeah. So, hello, good evening from my side as well, from Friedrich-Ebert Foundation. I'm Ernst Hillebrand, the director of the FES office here in Warsaw. I'm very happy that we have two outstanding intellectuals from Poland and from the United States, Sheri Berman and Sławomir Sierakowski, with us to discuss about the implications of the election, because we can't talk yet about the elections results itself. So, but I think many things are already there that are extremely interesting, especially from a center-left interpretation of politics. Many people expected a different outcome, didn't expect that Trump would fare so good. This must have some explanation that Sheri certainly can help us to understand. And so, yeah, I'm looking forward to a very interesting debate. Many thanks to Sheri, many thanks to Sławomir for taking the time. Many thanks to Mia for the cooperation with Krytyka once again. And yeah, thank you so much.
Dziękuję, Ernst.
Thank you very much, Ernst. We are going to be also talking about what had been going on during the elections. Obviously, we are not going to be talking about results. We are not going to know the ultimate election results. Votes are still being counted in Arizona, in North Carolina, in Georgia, and last but not least in Pennsylvania. But we are going to be talking about long-term phenomena extending beyond the elections themselves. We are going to be talking in excellent company. We have been joined by Professor Sheri Berman, politologist of Barnard College of the Columbia University, author of at least two very important works on the political history of social democracy and democracy, Fallacy of Politics, published several years ago, and Democracy and Leadership in Europe. Sheri Berman is also a publicist. She was publishing in Foreign Policy and also Dissent, a very important political magazine. We have also been joined by Sławomir Sierakowski, publicist, intellectual, analyst, the chairman of the Brzozowski Association, the founder and member of Krytyka Polityczna, Political Critique Foundation in Poland. We are going to be talking about whether this particular style of practicing politics contributed to the US and the world by Donald Trump, and a certain social bedrock or foundation that allowed Trump to win, and which had obviously been consolidated over the last years of his years in the White House. Regardless of the results of elections, results that we do not know yet, well, we are going to be wondering whether Trumpism is a phenomenon that can be reversed or overcome. Obviously overcome in terms of liberal values, progressive values, left-wing values. Those are most definitely detailed questions. Nonetheless, I believe that we would definitely want things to happen in a very specific direction. I would like to start by asking Professor Sheri Berman to discuss this particular topic. In other words, Professor, do you believe that what has happened in the United States over the past years and what has become associated with Donald Trump's name are those phenomena that can be overcome given the overall election polling forecast. Do you see the possibility of the US being reconstructed and restored in a form and shape much more desirable and positive than what we are facing today?
Okay, well, thank you very much for those extremely difficult questions and for inviting me to come and speak with you today. So, as I'm sure everybody here is aware, we still do not know exactly what the outcome of the election will be. There's still counting going on in a bunch of states where the margins remain razor thin. We do know, however, that like the previous election, Biden has won the popular vote. In fact, this time he seems to be over the 50% margin, which is greater than the number of votes and the percentage that Clinton got. But of course, in the United States, because we have a kind of crazy electoral system, winning the popular vote, winning a majority does not necessarily mean that you win the presidency. So this will drag on, as you heard and as you know, probably for another day or two and perhaps longer because of myriad court cases that the Trump administration has already brought. But the bigger question about Trumpism, about the style of politics that Trump and the Republican Party that he leads now represents, this question remains important regardless of who wins the election. Of course, if Trump wins the election, these trends will get worse. They will become deeper and more entrenched in American society. But even should he lose, should Biden win, we're talking about trends that are of a very, very long-term nature. The proximate way, I think, to think about the type of politics we are experiencing in the United States, and it is obviously not distinct, unique to the United States. This kind of politics has spread throughout many parts of the globe, not least in Poland and other parts of Eastern Europe, is a politics that is characterized by extreme polarization. I don't know obviously what the Polish term for that would be, but by polarization, what political scientists mean is deep underlying divisions among citizens between members of different political parties, right? So democracy works fine when people have significant major policy differences. It does not work well when you see your opponents not merely as people with whom you differ over policy, but as people who you see as a threat, who you are fearful and resentful of, who you believe that if they should win an election, represent existential threat to your way of life. Democracy cannot work in that kind of high stakes, fear-based, threat-based context. And it is very important to differentiate that again from contexts where parties and citizens differ very significantly over policy. Democracy works fine for that. Indeed, it is made precisely to deal with differences. But when people are motivated by fear, they feel threatened and they believe their opponents are not just people who differ from them policy-wise, but are actual threats to their existence, democracy does not work well. And so this kind of polarization is what we have in the United States today, and it is why it makes our politics such high stakes, why we have had the kind of election that we've had unfolding over the last months and indeed going on now past election day. So I thought I would talk, as you heard in the introduction, a little bit about some of the longer term trends that have fed this polarization that can help explain why we are now in the United States and by extension, perhaps in other parts of the world, living in a society characterized by this kind of sense of threat, of fear, of resentment, of the stakes just simply being extremely high. So some of these trends I think are kind of intuitive to people across the globe. One of the important trends that has fed into polarization in the US and elsewhere has to do with the way the economy has developed over the past decades. We now have in the United States extremely high levels of inequality, income and wealth inequality. And along with that has gone diminishing social mobility. That means that we're not just a more unequal society, we're a society where one's parents' income has an extremely strong impact on how successful one is likely to be. So that there's not anything resembling the kind of equality of opportunity, the sort of traditional American dream that was such a prevalent part of, sort of what held the United States together and made it so attractive to people outside of the United States in the decades after the Second World War. So we've had deepening economic divisions in the United States, and again, almost the beginnings of what could be considered a caste-like system. Again, where you are born in the income distribution really significantly shapes where you're going to end up, in the adult part of your life. And this has made, again, a lot of people very resentful. Of course, in times of economic stress, it's much easier to scapegoat others, to look for people to blame for your problems. And this gives an opportunity to politicians who want to point to minorities, liberal elites, and others as the source of these kinds of problems. I should also note that as in Poland and in many other countries, these economic divisions have increasingly mapped onto geographic ones, so that much more than in the past, you have cities, large metropolitan areas being the most dynamic economically, the place where sort of cutting edge businesses and industries are located, while rural areas and areas sort of in the heartland of the country have really fallen behind. This was not as much the case during the post-war decades. And so we have these kinds of economic divisions that have increasingly overlapped with geographic ones, which have created, again, much easier sense amongst the population that we are really divided into different countries with different interests and different outlooks. The second factor, not entirely unrelated to the first, is social and demographic changes. And so the United States has always been a country of immigrants, but we have now in the United States a greater percentage of foreign-born citizens than we've had at almost any time in the past. And this has also obviously corresponded over the last decades to increasing mobilization by minorities and women and others who are seen as kind of threats to a more traditional status quo. And so what these trends have done is, again, they have made some sectors of the white population feel threatened, like their status in society is being diminished, like they are threatened by the changing demographics of the country. And this is, as I said, related to the economic trends because it creates a very fertile field for those who want to whip up a sense of use scapegoating to try to make folks feel like it is these new citizens, it is these minority groups who are to blame for their problems by taking away resources, by not playing by the rules of the game, by threatening their values and so on. So the concatenation or the coordination of these two trends is really very deadly, right? The sense by many that they are falling behind economically, combined with the sense that the society, the demographics of society is changing around them, creates a really volatile mix that makes it very easy for politicians to kind of whip up these fears and resentments. And this brings me now to my third long-term factor, and that has to do with politics in the United States. So if you were to look at American political parties during the decades after the Second World War, they would look very different than they do today. Both the Democratic and the Republican Party were much more diverse internally than they are today. So Democrats had within their party a large sector of conservative Southern Democrats. Republicans had within their party much more moderate figures from the Northeast of the country and the Midwest of the country. And so the parties included within them people with different political views, people from different parts of the country, people with very different racial and ethnic backgrounds, people with different levels of education. They were much more diverse coalitions. But what started to happen over the last decades, probably triggered by some of the changes of the 1960s, civil rights, Vietnam War, a whole bunch of other things, is that the parties started to very much sort. So that today the Republican parties and the Democratic Party are very, very different from each other, both with regards to what they advocate, as well as with regards to who votes for them. So if you tell me today something about the religiosity of a particular voter, about where that voter lives, about how much education that voter has, and to some degree about the color of their skin, I can make a very good guess, better than I could have some decades ago, about who they vote for. So the Republican Party is a party primarily of white folks. These are more religious Americans. They are Americans who tend not to live in metropolitan urban areas, but in rural areas or in ex-urban areas. They tend to have lower levels of education, and they are not poor. The Democratic Party now is much more multi-ethnic than the Republican Party is. It has a disproportionate share of voters coming from large metropolitan urban areas. It has poor people, but it also has very highly educated, higher income people, and it is more secular than the Republican Party is. Now, this is problematic because this sort of sorting, this kind of clear separation in the type of voters that exist in different parties means that these different parties, obviously they look different from each other, and it is much easier, therefore, for politicians to create a sense that someone from the other party is not, again, just someone who differs from you on policy issues, but who is fundamentally different, who has a different identity, who has different values, who has a different vision of what the United States is, who is a threat perhaps to the way that you live your life and to the type of community you live in. When divisions in society reinforce rather than cross-cut, when citizens end up interacting with on a regular basis, not just in the political sphere, but in the social sphere, in their workplaces, in their local communities, in the various groups that they belong to, when they end up interacting with people very similar to themselves, it really makes it much easier to see folks from different parties with different political identifications as really fundamentally different from you. And again, therefore, much easier for politicians to whip up the sense that these folks are a threat, that their opposition is illegitimate. So to sum up, I would say that in the United States, the sort of polarization that Trump has both benefited from and furthered, right? It has precisely been his strategy to use these divisions and resentments to solidify his base, to get his base to feel that if he doesn't win, that they are threatened, to get his base to feel that the other side is illegitimate and not only differs from them again on policy issues, but should they come to power, that they would be very much threatened. He's used this polarization for his own purposes. He's deepened these trends, and it's going to therefore be very, very hard to reverse them even with a Biden victory. Without a Biden victory, they will only deepen because it has been precisely Trump's strategy to take these divisions and resentments and to use them to his advantage. Should Biden win, there is a chance that these trends could begin to be reversed. But what we must understand is that these kinds of economic divisions, these kinds of divisions over how society should look, these kinds of understandings of politics and what political identities are, these will not change should Biden be declared the winner, hopefully in the next few days. It will require a lot of work on the part of the Democrats And one would hope on the part of Republicans to reverse these trends. This means figuring out, first of all, ways to solve society's problems. As long as our societies are deeply divided economically, as long as we don't have agreement on who is entitled to the rights and responsibilities of citizenship, as long as we don't have agreement on the fact that policy differences are legitimate and that we should be able to argue about them, but still see our citizens as legitimate parts of the political process, the underlying polarization that has so weakened American democracy will not end. So we need first, should the Democrats win, for the Democrats to focus on beginning to solve some of our country's problems, right? Economic problems, social problems, pandemic-related problems, problems dealing with how to control technology, including social media, and figuring out ways to convince at least those Republicans who will listen that although they may not like the policies that Democrats always pass, that they do not want to disenfranchise or threaten Republicans, that they prefer to work with them, that they see, as Biden loves to say, not red states and blue states, that is to say, not Republican states and Democratic states, but United States. And so trying to kind of tone down or temper the very, very high level of tension and resentment that exists in American society, alongside dealing with, again, the underlying problems that have enabled this kind of polarization to flourish. That is what the left needs to do in these kinds of polarized situations. This is the kind of thing that the left needs to do to fight populism. It must be united. It must be positive rather than negative. It must search for friends rather than enemies. It must solve society's problems while at the same time doing the best that it can from a rhetorical or ideological perspective to convince those on the other side of the political divide that we all have America's or Poland's or whoever's best interests at heart. I will say that given the depth of these divisions in the United States, it is very easy to become overwhelmed. I think a lot of people are surprised, particularly on the left, that the election is even as close as it has been, given the number of missteps and the number of outrageous things that Trump has done. Democrats, even if they win the presidency, did not make the kinds of gains in the Senate or the House of Representatives or at the state level that they had hoped. So even should Biden win, there is going to be a lot of work to be done over the next 4 years. But one thing that should make people optimistic is that one thing elections reflect is the broad array of mechanisms that democracy has to change course, to correct mistakes. That is something that is built into democracy. If societies, if countries are going down a bad path, if mistakes have been made, democracies have built-in mechanisms, elections, protests, civil society, built-in mechanisms to correct those mistakes, for people to change their minds, for people to choose new leaders and governments who can put their countries on a different path. And so no matter how bad things look in the United States, and they do look pretty bad, one thing that makes us hopeful, and I think that should make people living in democracies more generally hopeful, is that as long as democracy exists, we have the opportunity to convince our fellow citizens that a change is needed. And we can do that peacefully, and we can do that regularly. And I hope that when we look back on 2020 in the United States, that is in fact the narrative that we see. So thank you very much.
Dziękuję bardzo, pani profesor.
Thank you, Professor. In your comment, you especially pointed out to what lies ahead in terms of tools to overcome polarization. We see that polarization as very acute in the United States, but in Poland, Polish citizens and the Polish electorate also experience that. We frequently talk over here about the need to overcome polarization, to redefine the political conflict, to blunt it down a little, but some say this is not always possible. Perhaps there are various causes and reasons, some of them objective, at least such that are beyond our control, are somehow doomed to being separated, where it is of necessity to declare which side you're on. Sławomir Sierakowski, who studies American but also Polish politics, tell us please, is that phenomenon, that polarization phenomenon in the United States, really amenable to overcoming, and is it worth fighting for that overcoming, for bridging the gap? Well, I, by and large, agree with Professor Sheri Berman, so I can just be subservient in my speech. Maybe I will elaborate on some thoughts and maybe just differ in some details. Despite the fact that the results are not yet fully known, but we can start guessing. Well, Trump already guessed. He was the fastest to guess that he already won. I see a general commentator trend that since initially Biden was expected to have a much clearer victory, then even if he wins, it can be seen as a failure, and the Senate will not be a democratic, will not have a democratic majority, which hampers what the president can do. And Biden is a whole bag full of limitations. The anti-Trumpist or alternative policy, which Professor Berman also published in her article in our journal, is a long-term task. It requires looking at the social processes with very good leadership. It's a difficult long-term task. Who else should do it? I think both parties will be at loss to find somebody like Trump. Well, Trump still will be there. He will be the candidate in 2024. But the Democrats will also struggle, because the elections, which we may remember as a rivalry between two elderly gentlemen, also showed us a new promising faces in in American policy, and Ms. Harris is that example. And there are also divisions in the Democratic Party. She is seen to be a radical in the Democratic Party. She was to be support for Biden. This was to avoid the situation where some of Sanders' electorate stayed home and didn't vote for Hillary Clinton. Kamala Harris was to prevent that behavior. But it is unclear how she will deal with the radicalism that she is that is attributed to her, at least progressivism. The Polish polarization, where Jarosław Kaczyński is the god of polarization in politics, has polarized even his own political party. And Trump, let's also take note, even though he has a better result, a relatively better result in absolute numbers and also in percentages, he also led to a polarization among his own electorate. And for Jarosław Kaczyński, this can be a destructive development because now, breaching the abortion compromise, he led to a situation where his own party will not be able to present a unified position, and they're going to have a rolling conflict here, and it shows a weakness of the leader. Trump showed that he is powerful because despite all the scandals and crises and the, well, shameful behaviors, he still garnered a big result, a big number of voters, but that also speaks for some kind of weakness because he is one of the few presidents who will only have one term of office. But he can remain an active politician, a certain power in the Republican Party, but still a loser. I agree with the culturalist claim, a general thesis that has been with us for several decades. We published several books by Clow and other sociologists and politologists who pointed out that the further west, the more the class war undergoes sublimation into a cultural war, and this happens at the expense of a democratic opposition, the left-wing opposition, and becomes a playground for right-wing politicians, right-wing populist politicians. In the northern hemisphere, it's difficult to create left-wing populism, and gaining legitimacy through scandal, Trump's scandalism, not only his own, gives him a better rapport with the angry, indignant voters. They sort of show that they have stronger genes sociobiologically. This is evidence for strength, even though I cause the scandals, I'm ready to represent you. He shows determination, he shows power, strength, and strength becomes a much better currency than competence. And this will again work for the thesis mentioned by Professor Berman, that rebuilding of the alternative populist policy will be difficult because power, force, brute force cannot be part of that policy by definition. Biden is not a politician of brute force. Brute force is not what the Democratic Party wants to be identified with, and that will still give populism the upper hand, and it gives Trump the upper hand at the expense of the left wing. And Trump has laid down the rules of the game, and the right-wing political scene is manned by his people. He changed the Republican Party. Mitt Romney, for example, those are people which are marginal, the margin of the margin. They are decent people which should be recognized, but they are like people who committed apostasies. They're neither of the church nor of the left. And Trump, using blackmail in a way, created his own generation, political generation, and the Trumpism that Professor Berman speaks of will stay with us in that sense that the Republican Party, at least in part, will be much more pro-Russian. It will be a much more populist party than before. And looking at studies, alternative studies, so to say, alternative to the thesis that neoliberalism in politics led to the development of populism in politics. Thomas Pickering formulated that theory. Brahmins and Merchants, his publication, Brahmins and Traders, maybe. Once upon a time, the Democrats had an electorate that was much more popular class in terms of class representation, while the Republicans represented the establishment, the educated, well-to-dos, and the popular class could find their representation in politics. They didn't have to look for strange weirdos like Trump. Then the Democrats became a representation of the cultural elites of the broadly understood establishment. So the orphaned are those less educated, those less well-to-do, and that is what the populists built their strength on. It wasn't only Trump. This is something that happened all over the world, and it's very difficult to turn this around. And I would like to now narrow down to what's happening in these hours as we speak. Relative to the election, what struck me in the States recently, but also a few years before. I used to live there, but when I look at Polish media like TVN24, which is a Polish CNN, so to say, I see slant to the opposition and a disillusionment with the governing populist party, but I see a withdrawal, a reservation to really criticize, while in CNN I see Fox News but ours, so to say. I identify with their sentiment, but I think the great underrating of Trump in surveys, in opinion polls, is secondary to a great pressure from the establishment. So it's something that the uneducated, even though the pollsters were supposed to be methodologically prepared, and they weren't. And I think their error in the poll results was even larger than it was 4 years ago. So I think our own side of the political scene shows significant deficits, significant shortages in what they do. And another thing that Professor Berman mentioned, metro, non-metro America and the geographic divide. A growing divide between the city and rural areas or small town areas. That is also very salient in Poland. The pandemic was important also here because it differently affected individualized metropolitan communities than it did in the rural communities. So the processes were much more difficult to understand. So we could think of Trump playing the clown, but what he said and acted was much more understandable for the rural electorate. Trump will continue to rule for 76 days, and he can inundate America with court cases. He is also threatened by criminal cases against him. So he will change whatever he can. He will fire the boss of the FBI. He will probably fire Anthony Fauci. And he will be able, until mid-January, refurnish or refurbish the scene. And he is also a politician who will be able to jump to the media for 4 years out of politics. He has 88 million followers on Twitter. And we know what media are really have the weight in politics in order to then quickly, nimbly jump into politics again. He knows how it's done.
We should also understand that Trump is tantamount to Republicans. He got 93% of Republican voters. That's even incomparable to Andrzej Duda in the context of his own party. I do believe that this is yet another advantage for him. There is one other thing to be considered, and that was quite a surprise to me. This is also in the context of what I heard on CNN, associating everything with economy rather than pandemic. Many people believe that things have improved for them under Trump. 41%, if memory serves, that they are better off under Trump. Only 20% have responded in surveys that they are worse off. So I think that this also ties in with public memory and public perception. I would also be inclined to say that Donald Trump is part of the mass culture. He's been around for 30 years. He was part of bankruptcies and scandals, and he can survive anything, including presidential failure, and will still remain at the top. So to put it bluntly, I think that Biden is going to be a somewhat weak president, and Trump will remain a leader of the American Republicans with an opportunity to go back into politics. Unfortunately, we are condemned to Trump, even if Biden wins. Thank you very much. Yes, well, that is the fundamental question. Optimistically, should Biden win? And obviously, we do not know that yet. We also remain with the topic of the Senate. I understand that Republicans have one more vote in the Senate. So my question to Professor Berman: how can we imagine some kind of political policy that could make it possible for that president, Joe Biden, could be accepted or prove himself acceptable to more than 50% of the US? We know that in many topics, Obamacare, for example, is social support, according to surveys, is quite high. Goes well beyond 50% of the society. But when it comes to party disputes, this is a topic that definitely causes polarization. So what do you think Joe Biden would have to do in terms of engaging in some kind of policy that could make him acceptable to 50% or more than 50% of Americans? Obviously, we also cannot be sure how many people voted actually for Joe Biden and how many of these voted against Trump, just to get Trump out of office. So in that context, would you please care to respond? Thank you.
So let me just start with one factual point, which is that Biden has won more than 50% of the vote. So he has the support, at least as far as we can assess that by using votes as a proxy, of more than 50% of Americans. So if we in the US were not living in a federal system, but had a unitary electoral system where the majority just straight up got to pick the president, there'd be no question Biden would have won. Clinton also would have won, for that matter. But we don't live in that world. And that's important, not only for understanding why the election is dragging out like this, but also to understand why it is that even should Biden ultimately prevail, that is to say, should he be able to match his popular vote victory with an electoral vote victory, he will still have some very severe limitations. So my colleague already mentioned the Senate, which it looks very unlikely that the Democrats will be able to take. There is a very, very outside chance they might end up with 50 of those 100 seats. There's 2 elections in Georgia for Senate seats that have not yet been called. It's unlikely they would win both of those. They have lost some of their support in the House, which again was very surprising. They will still retain a majority there, but a lesser one than they had before. And also very, very important in the American context is that Democrats not only didn't make gains at the state level, they actually lost ground to a not insignificant degree. And despite the intense focus on the presidency and the Supreme Court, what I think a lot of people, even a lot of Americans, do not fully recognize is that much of the policy that affects our everyday lives is not actually made at the federal or the national level or exclusively at that level. So many of the hot button issues that define American politics, whether it's abortion, whether it's gun rights, whether it's recently, sort of talk about reforming the police, all of these things are things that happen to a very significant degree at the state level. And Democrats over the last years really have fallen so far behind at these levels. Now, part of that is a reflection of some of the trends that I mentioned before. So many of the rural states have become really much more composed of people who have characteristics that predispose them towards the Republican Party. But that begs the question of why the Democrats have not been either willing or able to figure out ways to appeal to these kinds of voters, the voters outside of the urban areas, the voters who are somewhat less educated, the voters who have fallen behind economically, who live in communities that are really in some ways struggling. Democracy has to be about convincing citizens of your policy, of your view, of your vision of the future. In a democracy, you have to win a majority, not just of the votes. Again, at the national level, Democrats do that. But in a federal system, you have to win majorities across a whole variety of different kinds of categories. And the Democrats have not been as good at that over the past decades as they should probably have been. So to get back to the original question, what can Biden do? Well, without the Senate and without Democrats dominating state level governments, what he can do will be somewhat limited. But the same was true of Trump in a whole variety of ways, right? He was not able to pass a lot of his legislation, partially because a lot of Republicans didn't like some of the things he wanted to do, particularly with regards to foreign policy. They were never able to come together in an alternative vision to Obamacare, which is, up through the pandemic was the most important issue, that is to say healthcare. What will Biden have to do? Well, he will have to hold together whatever Democrats he has. It is highly unlikely he will pull any Republicans over. And so without the Senate, the kinds of major policy initiatives that a lot of Democrats had hoped for will be very difficult. So he will have to try to work with what he has in the House and the people that he has at the state level. There, actually, governors tend to be somewhat more pragmatic than their counterparts at the national level because voters in local and state elections are somewhat more focused on local and state issues than they are on, sort of the big ideological issues. That's less true than in the past, but still more true, right? So whether or not governors decide, for instance, to do things like extend Medicaid to their own citizens, that was a choice. Actually, some Republican governors initially refused to make, right? The national government under Obama said, look, give your citizens access to this program and we will help pay for it. And they refused out of ideological reasons. Many of them ended up paying a price for that. Similarly with tax cutting, we had significant tax cutting at the state level in these hardcore Republican districts over the course of several years that ended up hurting things that people care about, like education, like infrastructure. And so some Republican governors had to backtrack on some of those things. These are the kinds of slow bore, very, kind of long-term efforts that Biden and the Democrats are going to have to focus more attention on, because without the Senate, they can't pass things that they'd like to. And so having to work around that and figure out ways to make things happen at the state level with the governors and the legislative bodies they have, and to try to convince some Republican governors to kind of do things that might not align with what their national party does. You know, and you can expect, by the way, that despite all the screaming and yelling about Trump's executive orders, that Biden will resort to those too, just as Obama did. That is something that partisans like to scream about, but that both parties will do. But it will be harder to deal with our country's problems without unified government, but that is the nature of the American system.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask Sławek Sierakowski, not necessarily a question tying in with the policy, with specific reforms, but the capacity for implementing policy. Both of you were talking about reasons for polarization in the United States, the polarization effect is quite pronounced in terms of national media and social media. We have at least one political party in Poland, in the United States, we have a political party with very specific and distinct beliefs concerning economy. That's the Democratic Party. And on the other hand, we have a party with a tendency of pushing out anyone coming up with a conciliation proposal for the other side. And all of that ought to be considered with the quasi-monopoly source of power that is social media, even to a greater extent than in Poland. In the United States, the social media are determining people's beliefs concerning political programs or policies or preferences. So do you see any kind of opportunity to lay ground for future changes? Well, paradoxically, even Donald Trump is a great example proving that you can overcome the establishment. The establishment was heavily criticized, and the division between different kinds of Republicans and different kinds of Democrats had been a fact. Those Republicans that we were complaining about, Christian Light and libertarians and hawks of new economies, we had certain complaints, or we had certain problems with certain factions of the Republicans, if you were. But Bernie Sanders, for example, taught us and showed us that you can actually enter the establishment from an unthinkable position in the United States, unthinkable several years before. Well, Biden's program has actually been written by Sanders to a major extent. If we were to take a look at programs of the primary election candidates, well, Sanders had actually been the author of their programs. So neither Trump nor Sanders have to be a hero, any kind of romantic hero, but they have both shown that parties can be changed, that you can actually embark upon a grassroots effort and find money for it. Trump, I remember when Trump actually announced his nomination, he actually had some kind of interview on CNN, and obviously that had been no chance that he mentioned it. And when he said it during a CNN conference that he is going to run, people thought it was a joke. Whereas 4 years later, if memory serves, it turned out that he was actually running. There is also Steve Bannon, a guy whom we thought was insane, but he was succeeded. It's not about Facebook or Twitter that actually influenced everybody, but alternative media, the ultra-right platforms, and Steve Bannon obviously developed at the grassroots level for limited funds, seemingly insane. All that showed that we do have the opportunity of making the populist American dream coming true. So we have bad guys succeeding, but good guys. Sanders is a good guy. So I think that I would be inclined to talk. I would be inclined to be quite prudent and cautious in terms of such theses. I can imagine extensive. Well, okay, let me go take a step back. Obama, he also a guy from nowhere. He was fantastic. He was a huge success. Biden would not have been where he is now were it not for Obama. So I believe that, well, in the superstructure, to use Marxist language, you can operate in politics. It's a totally different story when it comes to economy. Now, how can we change it? We are trying to answer such questions. Rich people across the world have declared they're going to be self-taxing. They are making huge donations. Bill Gates, but not only him, the wealthy of this world have decided to get together and finance problems in Africa and combating hunger or famine and a COVID vaccination. So there are things that we can talk about at a general level in the superstructure, but it has to be borne in mind that should we make an attempt to translate those political theses onto reality, that is going to be a true challenge. I don't know if people will manage.
Thank you. Maybe I would turn this question to Professor Berman. Is it actually so that the examples of people entering politics from so to say nowhere? Well, Trump was certainly a celebrity, but not a politician before. So I will ask whether the discussions pushed by Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, who was less radical, but she also entertained views from outside of the hitherto consensus. So is that proof that this can be replayed, redone on the progressive side of the scene? We're not talking of changing the media sphere here, because the examples on the Trumpist side are more salient. Can the progressive or left-wing political scene do something similar?
Sorry, by similar, do you mean bring fresh faces, young people into the movement? Or do you mean sort of shifting the party significantly to the left? Or perhaps are you referring to both?
I'm afraid we don't have sound from Mr. Sierakowski. So the right wing actually was successful in doing all of these things. They gained votes, they won the presidential election, they changed the political profile of the party, and they also built a whole media sphere around it, like talk radios, not only outright. But do you think that the left wing is able to do something similar? Or possibly are there some deeply entrenched causes that the right wing is better placed to do these things than the left?
Okay. So let me reiterate something I alluded to briefly earlier, which is that the Republican Party that we're seeing today is not a product of Trump. It is the product of a decades-long effort on the part of conservative activists to reshape not just the Republican Party, but the United States. This effort began during that period of sort of liberal ascendance in the 1960s. We had a Supreme Court at that time, the Warren Court, that was by far the most liberal in our history, that did the kinds of things on the other side of the spectrum that Democrats and progressives are worried the Supreme Court is going to do today. It completely, the Warren Court, revolutionized the United States. It took decisions in civil rights, in criminal law, in constitutional law that literally changed the nature of American society and politics. This was, of course, also the same era of Kennedy and Johnson, when at the national political level, legislation was being passed, civil rights legislation most notably, also Great Society programs that was really changing the way the United States looked. And at that point, conservatives looked around them and they saw a fairly hopeless looking landscape. But what they decided to do was engage in a long-term strategic effort to change politics and to change American society. It is the fruits of that we began to see with Ronald Reagan, and it is the culmination of a very warped version of that we have seen with Donald Trump. This means, right? This means investing in organizations that try to shape the way people think about economics. It means investing in organizations that try to change the type of education and ideology that exists at American law schools, that tries to cultivate conservative activists, that tries at the ground roots level, at the local level, at the state level, right, to influence legislation and to cultivate connections between activists and politicians that will enable Republicans to capture power over the long term. They have been extremely successful in this, much more successful than Democrats, who have focused, in my view, and in the view of many other scholars, far too much on things like the courts and the universities, and not enough on the bottom-up politics that really changes political dynamics over the long term. So, can the Democrats do this? Sure. But the question is, who has the stomach, who has the organizational stamina to start thinking about how the United States and political dynamics are going to look different, not 2 years from now, not 4 years from now, but 20 years from now. Because what we're seeing in the United States today on the right is the culmination of, like I said, decades of effort. And so for the Democrats to not just win, hopefully, this election, right, that we're still counting votes for, but to try to create the kind of long-term progressive coalition, that is the kind of thing that takes decades to build. And a lot of people are, they're not interested in that kind of slow bore work. As for sort of injecting new voices into the system, well, that has already begun to happen. We've seen incredible youth activism. Finally, youth votes were up in this election. Every 4 years, people talk about, oh, young people are going to come out to vote. They did at least vote in higher numbers in this election than they have in the past. There's obviously been an incredible amount of activism. I teach college students for a living, trying to convince them to work at the local level, to work on their community boards, to think about their school boards, to think about how the actions that they do today are going to make a difference 10 years from now. That's a hard sell for young people, but that is precisely what conservatives have done. If you are a young conservative activist, you have tons of opportunities to engage in different programs and all these different kinds of activities that basically are a means of, ideological indoctrination and networking, right? And this is an attempt to kind of create a long-term commitment and a long-term strategy. Democrats could do that, right? But the question is what kinds of efforts they're going to focus on. But we have seen, I think, a really, a lot of enthusiasm on the left, but it is a fine line between, the kind of enthusiasm that threatens to tear the Democratic Party apart and the type of enthusiasm that can be channeled into creating a more unified but still progressive party. That's pretty much the argument that was going on during the primary. Sanders himself understood that after having lost, that the key thing was for the Democrats to win. A lot of his supporters were much less committed than he was, but people have to understand that this, compromise is necessary. The window for progressive policies has been pushed very far open. The Democratic Party is much more to the left than it was 4 years ago. But you have to recognize that if you don't keep together, if you're not unified, if everybody is not working towards certain long-term goals, then that will evaporate very quickly. And since we're facing a Republican Party, a conservative movement that is so well organized, so well funded, and so strategic, if the Democrats cannot match that kind of commitment, that kind of organization, that kind of strategic long-term vision, then they're going to have a lot of trouble turning all the potential that exists into long-term progressive change.
Dziękuję.
Thank you. Sławek, maybe we could reflect a while, because we have so far discussed assuming that it is Joe Biden who wins this election, and we're wondering what will be the constraints of his possible activities, of his possible clout. But let's rephrase the question. What happens, how does the scene change if Trump, for one reason or another, stays in the White House? For Trump, this would be evidence for the fact that he is perfectly legitimate, that his scandals legitimize him. I'm not sure if this can be called a reform. It's a revolution in the dogma of foreign policy. He will be even more confrontational versus China. Vis-a-vis Russia, he can then be much more openly cooperative. Actually, it could be Biden for Russia to exploit as a politician who does not have a bad track record. He was a VP with Obama, so he would not be a politician who would start fighting with Russia over Ukraine, Belarus, or Eastern Europe. He could possibly defuse the tension, create his own version of Ostpolitik. But Trump will not be accused of misdeeds, or possibly he will be able to ignore them because he's not going to face another election. And if he is so infatuated with Russia, he will be able to consume that union. That's very dangerous. And he will be able also to engage in all of his anti-NATO, anti-European phobias. And as for Biden, for example, Biden may decide that stopping Nord Stream 2 is a Trumpist project. That'll give him an alibi. He'll say, no, I don't have to follow that path. And to be friendly to the European Union, to be transatlantically conscious, he will make a gift to Germany of letting them build Nord Stream 2. However, on the other hand, Trump may open up to some friendly relations with Putin also. So there is no good way out of this conundrum from our point of view. We could count on Biden as a politician who would possibly exert more pressure on Poland to improve the conditions of rule of law and freedom of the media. Well, he's a politician. Well, Trump is a politician who hates liberal media, and they hate him back. And if he hears that TVN is the Polish version of CNN or New York Times, no sense of protecting that. And so if he doesn't see this as an American business which needs to be protected, then TVN will also not be defended, whereas it is defended until today. And so the traditional priorities of American policy are retained, they're kept up so far. Trump may want to prove certain things that he highlighted early. He wanted to sort of leave NATO or undermine NATO. Well, he was spurned by European politicians, so he will show them contempt in return, and that'll happen at the cost of Poland or at the cost of the West as a monolith, perceived as a monolith. And so Trump's America will become increasingly eccentric, where Trump will no longer try to cover up. Well, he didn't cover up too much before when it comes to policies vis-a-vis minorities. I think relatively he was least inclined to make good face to that. So in his second term of office, Trump can turn out as somebody really dangerous. I think that's where the big mobilization comes from in America. People like Kaczynski or like Trump need a motivated minority to keep them in office. While if Biden wins, he will actually unexpectedly mobilize a majority. We hope that this would happen to a larger scale, but as Professor Berman underscored, if Biden wins, then he's actually going to win. So no reason to complain here. We should just be happy. But Trump, if he wins, he can also drown America in a 6-month crisis, and somebody can take advantage of that. So that's the third option. We can have Biden, we can have Trump, we can have chaos. So let's just keep that third perspective in mind, which for Russia and China, this third perspective may be the most desirable. So I don't see many more fundamental possible pathways in American policy. Thank you. Professor, what is your view on the perspective like Donald Trump wins his second term, is this a reiteration of the first term, only more acute, or can we expect that something will change where the quality may be new, may be different?
So I would expect both, to answer your question in a rather confusing manner, which is, I think we will see a continuation of Trump's behavior, but it will become more dangerous and it will undermine American democracy further. He will feel vindicated in doubling down on his strategy of, as I spoke of early, mobilizing his base, not reaching out to other Americans, but trying to get as many of his supporters as mobilized as possible based on fear and resentment. We have already seen that has begun to seep into extra parliamentary and even violent activities in some places. This kind of thing will get worse. It will get more prevalent. His attacks on the Democrats, on the free press, on liberal elites will continue, and people will become much more radicalized. I expect that will also, by the way, encourage more radical tendencies on the left. That is to say, people who will increasingly say that in order to fight back against the Republicans, we need to start not playing by the rules ourselves. As I've had conversations with several friends, it's very hard to be a Menshevik when you're fighting against Bolsheviks. And I think that calls on the left to play a little bit more fast and loose with the rules and try to change things in ways that are not fully consistent with democratic norms and procedures will increase. And I just suspect that a lot of our institutions will continue to decay. Trump will, in his second term, even more than his first, put people in positions of power as well as stock our institutions more generally with people whose only criteria for service is loyalty to him. And so all of the kinds of checks and balances, the independent expertise, and other kinds of things that we're supposed to have in our bureaucracies and various branches of government will simply decay even further. I'm not even going to begin to talk about what will happen, as some of my colleagues have discussed, with foreign policy, where, you know, Trump's erratic and completely zero-sum behavior has just played havoc, not only with many long-standing institutions that have helped to promote stability across the world, security arrangements, economic arrangements, but have just turned many of our allies, not just against us, but squabbling amongst themselves in ways that are just going to do damage that is going to be very, very hard to repair. So I expect to see more of the same, but I expect to see the consequences of that become much more dangerous and much more hard to correct. After 8 years of Trump, it's very hard for me to see what kind of condition American democracy will be in. The Republican Party will be even more Trump than it is now. The Democratic Party, I fear, will become more divided about how to deal with Trump. And I think this country will just continue to sort of tear itself apart in ways that are just really, really going to be very, very difficult to reverse.
Dziękuję.
Thank you.
Tak, włączyłem mikrofon. Chciałbym jeszcze Cię, Sławku, poprosić o to, żebyśmy się zastanowili.
Sławek, could we also talk about the potential of Trump winning? We were talking about what would happen, but possibly we should also ask, how should Europe react to act in her own best interest, specifically countries that we are close to, and what it is that we should hope for in that context? I was thinking about it. It is quite a difficult question. I think that we should all, and we are going to see that as a cold shower. Well, populist problems are not an anomaly. Populism is a standard. And if you want to exit a standard, you have to do more than just sit there and wait. We cannot sit on our hands and wait. Specifically, since the year of the convent, 2003, we should definitely go back to these ideas in terms of preventing renationalization and so on and so forth. So it's not really Trump, but more, should he win. He is going to put the pedal to the metal, and he is definitely going to pick up speed. Trump spent his first 2 years learning about politics, changing people in high positions. He was wandering around in the fog, in the dark. He was completely inefficient. He did not know things, whereas today he knows things. He has his party, he has his people. He is now like a train in full speed. He is not going to be interested in going down in history as a good politician. He will want to go down in history as a legend of the Republican Party. He will definitely not all of a sudden turn into a centrist politician. He is definitely going to be much more confrontational, much more difficult. And it goes without saying that he will definitely be able to trigger a shock reaction in the European Union. Without such a shock reaction, the European Union is simply going to fall apart. I cannot imagine us drifting along in the wake of Brexit, in the wake of internal exits by Hungary and Poland. The European Union has a rather poor tradition of making any kind of decision over years rather than months. So I think that this is going to be the final chance, the last opportunity for keeping the process of European integration intact. I think this is something we ought to count on. We are slowly but surely drawing to a close of our meeting. I would like to ask Professor Sheri Berman for a good advice for Europe from across the pond. What do you think we should do? Should Donald Trump win his second term? Something we don't want, obviously, but should that happen, what do you think we as Europe ought to embark upon as a sound scenario?
So if Trump were to win, we would have another 4 years continuing the neglect of the American-led post-war order and the security and economic arrangements that have helped to define it. You know, everybody has been waiting. I am a Europeanist, partially a Europeanist by training. Everybody has been waiting for Europe to kind of be able to take up a greater leadership role. We are all waiting for that to happen. It has not yet happened, but it will become increasingly imperative for Europeans to try to figure out not only how to solve their own problems, security problems, dealing with Russia, for example, economic problems, how to deal with slow growth economies that also have many of their own problems, how to deal with severe divisions within the European Union over how to deal with common challenges, whether it be immigration or climate change. Europeans will have to recognize that they're going to have to do these things more on their own, that the United States won't be there to provide some of the frameworks and some of the backup, and that if they can't manage to do that somehow, many of these problems will fester, influencing not only their own futures, but the futures of many on the globe. Personally, I'm not 100% sure how that will happen, since the European Union is not set up in such a way to make strong, decisive action easy. It's a kind of worse version of the United States in that sense. We have so many checks and balances in our system, some of which we've discussed already, that, you know, even when you win an election, it can be very hard to get things done. The various rules and institutions that make up the European Union are also similarly not designed for decisive action, but the situation is going to get harder for Europeans. They're going to be confronted with these challenges, not just the long-term ones like climate change, but the more immediate ones: Russia, immigration, dealing with economic problems that spill across borders. So if the Europeans want to begin to improve their own situation, they're going to have to recognize, if Trump wins again, that they're going to have to do it on their own, and hopefully figure out some new ways to be able to do that.
Bardzo dziękuję.
Thank you very much. Those conclusions and the diagnoses offered during our meeting, while not necessarily optimistic, neither for the US nor for the rest of the world, Europe included, well, nonetheless, the conclusion that Europe will have to fend for itself should Trump win. Definitely, we are definitely going to be expected to be much more self-sufficient. That, I believe, is a key conclusion in the context of a huge motive that we have not discussed here, but it definitely is an elephant in the room. That is the climate change. The unfortunate and amazing crisis, which most definitely determines the terms and conditions for any kind of action we can take in the future, not to mention the fact that it shall also determine our lifestyle and our more or less immediate future. We are definitely going to be focusing on that particular topic in the future. Professor Sławek, I would like to thank you both for this meeting. I am deeply convinced that this is most definitely not my last question. It is definitely not the last meeting. I would like to thank the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation. I would like to also thank our interpreters. The interpreters wish to thank you. We are in awe of you. I would also want to thank Dominika Wróblewska and Barbara Szelewa, both of whom worked with us to put this meeting together. And all that remains for me to do is to invite you, ladies and gentlemen, to join us again. Professor, thank you very much from the bottom of my heart for this meeting, and we will definitely see you in the future. Sławek, thank you.
Thank you all. Wish us luck.
Wszystkim sobie życzymy szczęścia.
Good luck to us all. To you and to us, right?
Yes. All right. Have a good rest of your evening, I guess.